From the Mercy One studio.
Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you live from these United States of America. I am over here in snowy Des Moines, Iowa, where we have got to winter earlier than most people were thinking. Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences. And the director of the Zeta Institute. You can check us out at mchs.edu and zetainstitute.com. Bud, out there in Pittsburgh, what are you guys up to?
Well, it's snowy and wintry here as well. I'm the director at the National Institute for Newman Studies in the heart of Pittsburgh, and you can find more at newmanstudies.org.
I think most of the United States is in a winter wonderland. It even got cold, bitterly so, down in Oklahoma where my family was. But we had the 3 inches of snow, and my kids, they thought that was pretty great. Did you guys actually get accumulated snowfall out in the land of bridges?
Well, we got maybe 1.5 inches, but the problem here, as you may have picked up on when you visited, Bo, is that there are a lot of hills and bridges and tunnels. Oh my!
Yeah.
So even a light dusting can make driving sort of complicated.
I see. Is this where you're telling me that you have more dents in your van now?
Have more what?
More dents in your van?
There may or may not have been scratches, dents, fender benders yesterday. No, I waited till like 6:30 to drive home, and by then I think everyone had already done the apocalyptic rush. So
nice.
It was pretty easy driving for me.
I think it's funny that you have only very recently been in Rome, and I can't imagine that Rome to a snowy, even light dusting Pittsburgh are maybe some of the more opposite types of scenery one could be walking around in.
Although the driving is harrowing in both. And in Rome, it's kind of like, did I cover this on the radio last week? I forget. I don't want to recoup old ground.
No, I think you should make sure people know just in case there are going to be pedestrians in Rome.
Like the analogy, have you ever seen with factory farming where they're sorting the little chickadees?
Yeah.
And it's just like a chaotic sort of smash down a conveyor belt.
Right.
That's very much what it's like. And here they teach you to do defensive driving, but there defensive driving is frowned upon. And if you end up cutting someone off and getting like the best spot and the quote unquote line, they sort of tip their cap to you.
That's right. So that's why God spares Rome of snowfall and ice, because that sounds like a dangerous mix. Quite the cocktail to mix both of those two. So, well, as always, we are brought to you by Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu. When you're a college kid, it's maybe not as much fun to have snow out and about because you have to drive. They got a little bit of a snow day. They actually only had to go in at 10 in the morning that first day of snowfall, but I'm sure even then some of them are eagerly wanting to just go ahead and brave the snow and get into their classes, Bud, because we're tumbling on down to that end of the year, the first semester for many of them in their different programs. It's an exciting time. You get to go take a break, go hang out with family over Christmas. But one of the things that's unique about Mercy programs is how quickly you can do this. So there's even accelerated programs where after 1.5 years, you can have your BSN and be out in the field working. Mercy College of Health Sciences, mchs.edu.
Yeah, I have several regrets as a parent, but one of the big ones maybe is that homeschooling the kids, I've deprived them of snow days.
Right.
And I just remember as a little one, eagerly waking up if there was any dusting to see if there was going to be school canceled. I do feel, I'm going to sound like a fogey, but we let the kids down pretty lightly these days, right? Like, it doesn't take much.
Right.
When we were little, it was like, it had to be like 7 or 8 inches.
Yeah, no, I do think that's funny, too, to kind of gently remind people that if what you mostly remember from your childhood is if only God could rain down cold snow from the heavens in order for you not to go to a place, maybe we weren't doing it exactly right. But you know.
Mercy was delayed yesterday, right?
No, it was the day before, but yes.
Because I adjunct there, and I'll get these kind of emergency messages at 4 a.m, and I get really worried.
Right.
And then it's just you guys are delaying classes.
That's right. So yeah, don't let them keep telling you that, Bud. That was only Monday. So, Bud, Who do we have on the show today?
So our guest today is Dr. Paul Thigpen, and he's a renowned author. He's written many books. He's also been a professor of theology, a speaker. He's advised the U.S. bishops. But with it being the month of November and all, we thought we would turn our attention to the last things. He's recently published a work called Saints Who Saw Hell and Other Catholic Witnesses to the Fate of the Damned. So pretty intense reading, but I think as we talk to Dr. Thigpen and you and I break it down a bit, we'll see how what the church teaches on the last things really does feed into how we think about life in this world.
Not only the sort of honesty and the sort of brisk appreciation of the weight of our moral decisions, but also the hope interlaced in all of this that, of course, hell is not a predestined place all of us are to go, but that Christ dying for us and rising from the dead has given us a real hope, but only if we take serious the moral path before us. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. You want to make sure to stick around for that. And it's cold outside, but it's not snowing, but still, you could bundle around the fire, get yourself some early hot cocoa, settle down to listen to the Uncommon Good. We're not quite, like Bing Crosby singing an old Christmas song, but we're pretty cozy, and I think that you'll enjoy the show. So this is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around, because after this, we'll be back with Dr. Paul Thigpen talking about the saints who have seen hell. This will right after these messages. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for being on the show. We're glad to have you. But if you don't mind, could you introduce our guest for the show today?
Our guest this morning is Dr. Paul Thigpen, who's an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of 53 books. Among his most popular are Manual for Spiritual Warfare, A Year with the Saints, Daily Meditations with the Holy Ones of God. Paul, like Bo and I, is a convert to the Catholic faith, and he's served the church as a theology professor, historian, speaker, apologist, catechist, and member of the National Advisory Council of the USCCB. Dr. Thigpen, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
My first question is, when do you find time to sleep? That's quite the resume there.
Well, I've been writing, the writing especially. I've been doing that for a long, long time. So they're kind of stretched out over 30-something years. But the Lord's gracious, because I also have a family. I've got 5 grandkids. Live nearby, spend time with them, and part of a very active parish that I love dearly. Wonderful people here, and just love to be on the front lines of the work of the Lord.
That's awesome. So your most recent book is Saints Who Saw Hell and Other Catholic Witnesses to the Fate of the Damned. I'm just curious if you could touch on your personal life as you were writing this book and talking with friends and family about writing a book on hell. What sort of response did you get to that news?
Well, you can imagine. I guess the people that know me well, just said, "Oh, great, okay, we need to read more about that." Actually, the only of those books, I only wrote one novel, and that actually was kind of a 21st century setting for Dante's Inferno. So the novel was set in hell. So I guess the people that knew me didn't find that too surprising, although it's been years since I did that. But but for others to say, well, that's interesting. I haven't actually read a book about that, or never hear it talked about much. And my response would be, well, that's why I'm writing it. It needs to be talked about.
Yeah, you at the beginning of the book, you do talk about this drift that I think has taken place in culture and in the church, where my wife and I recently visited Rome, and when you're over there in the old churches, you see a lot of artistic depictions of hell and final judgment, maybe most famously the Sistine Chapel. But that's really waned in recent years, and I think you're right that you see less and less preaching and talking about hell. Do you have any theories as to why this sort of drift has taken place?
Well, I think in part it goes along with kind of this a general loss in our culture of the sense of sin, and this is something that's been going on for a while. Remember, even back before I was Catholic, during the time I was an atheist, which is I was for 6 years as a teenager. Remember, I'm thinking it was maybe Carl Menninger, but I'm not sure. Psychologist who was writing who wrote a book that was called "Whatever Happened to Sin," and so even this is back in the '60s. So even back in the '60s, people who were observing culture began to say, it's odd we don't talk about sin anymore. We may talk about sickness or that kind of thing, but people seem to have lost this sense of sin as a thing. And if you lose a sense of sin, of its seriousness, then of course you're going to lose a sense of interest in hell. But part of it too is, golly, it's as far ago as 150 years ago, Father Frederick Faber, who was a really well-known at the time convert to the Catholic faith in England, wrote a whole essay about this and how at that point already people in kind of this refined notion of religion that polite people don't talk about such things as hell, and even though Jesus did, which is the main reason why I think we need to talk about it, because he did. And he finally asked, in that essay, a really great question, I think, which we need to think about it, and that is, so is the only reason for religion to make us feel better, to soothe us, to console us, or is there supposed to be something more to faith, to our religion? Because it's also supposed to disturb us. It's supposed to make us uncomfortable in certain ways, just to make us feel good.
Paul, this is Bo Bonner. Thanks for coming on the show. One of the things in this sort of grand unwinding of the sense of sin, or even at least its magnitude and its immediate relevance as a convert myself, is, sin. When I was growing up, went to a Southern Baptist church, so sin got talked about plenty. I'm not going to deny that. There is a way in which it was very individual focused. So the idea is, you are a sinner, you have these problems, and that Jesus forgives you, yes, but also the work is sort of done on you. There's a lot of even sort of existential weight put behind sin. I think about the way that I got involved in theology and philosophy is you get someone like Kierkegaard, who under this sort of evangelical read is really the sort of philosopher of Christian angst over sin and things like this. Mm-hmm. But if you go back far enough to where you're talking about with even Faber and further back, the social understanding of sin, and I don't mean this in terms of like where we'll talk about society or structural sin. I'm talking about the idea that you mentioned Dante and you wrote a novel where it's in the 20th century, but this sort of way in which every sin has tectonic relevance, as it were. It shakes the foundation of so much more than just myself and just the state of my own soul. Do you start to see that as being one of the leading causes for us to, a difficulty to surmount, for us to realize why sin is important? It's one thing just to say, oh, I'm giving myself a break and I'm not going to worry that I'm a sinner. But if sin has this profound effect on everyone around me and the world itself, that maybe that's a way back into talking about why we still today need to talk about sin and hell.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. That it's much too easy in some traditions. The tradition I came out of to kind of just, as long as you keep it as an individual thing and individual consequences, to write it off as, well, God will take care of me and don't worry about me and I've got it covered. In fact, that goes along with another point I wanted to make, and that is that the surveys, there are organizations like the Pew, survey, will often ask as one of the questions about what do Americans believe. They'll do that regularly, ask about hell. And consistently what you get is more people than you might think in America believe in the existence of hell. But of the people who believe in hell, this huge percentage always says, they always respond to the question, do you think you have any chance of ever going there? And they'll say no.
Oh, wow.
And that comes in part out of one particular Christian tradition that basically says if you confess Jesus Christ as your Lord, personal Lord and Savior, that's it. It's done. You don't ever have to worry about it again. And so there's a kind of a false confidence in certain ways, not that the Lord can't save us, but that there's nothing more that needs to happen to prepare us for heaven, and that there's still this possibility that we could end up in hell. And so I think, in American culture especially, the prevalence of this notion that hell's just something we don't have to worry about because we've made a confession of faith contributes to this lack of talk about it, or if we're going to talk about it, only within the setting of kind of pointing the finger at others and saying, you're headed there because you're not in church or whatever.
Hmm.
So, Paul, kind of looking at how that could lead us astray, when you start digging into Catholic theology, into what some of the saints have seen in terms of visions of hell, how does that give us a certain kind of appropriate sobriety as we think about our own lives? And I guess, like as Bo said in the introduction, the weight of the moral decisions that we do make in this world.
It's, as you noted in the introduction, I make a point, that hell, someone once said, hell is the final guarantee that what we do really matters. That if you kind of write that off or say we all end up in the same place, whether it's annihilation or reincarnation or heaven or whatever, you're basically saying, okay, so it doesn't really matter what you do, does it? In the end, we all end up the same that way. And so it's, I think it's just so important that just as in the first letter of John says in Scripture that those who, he says that one day, in heaven, we will see him, God, face to face as he is, and we will be like him because we'll see him as he is. And that's the beatific vision. And then he has a second comment there that's so important. He says, and whoever has this hope within him purifies himself as he, God, is holy. And so that this hope of heaven and turning away from hell helps us to purify, gives us the motivation and is a channel of grace to purify our lives even now. But on the other hand, not to think about it, we lose all kinds of motivation. Not that fear is the only motivation, but the saints have said since early times that when we talk of fear of God, there are kind of like stages to that, you might say, that there's some folks who just aren't even going to give God the time of day unless there's some fear in them of hell. And that's what they call the fear of a slave, that he's afraid he's going to be beaten by the master if he doesn't serve the master. But as we grow and mature, it turns into, next stage would be the fear of the wage earner or the employer, the work of the servant that says, okay, I'm going to serve God just so I can get my reward. But that finally, at the highest level, fear of God is when we become friends of God. We don't see ourselves as slaves or even ultimately as we're wage earners, but we see ourselves as friends of God. And what we fear is anything that would come between us and the beloved, anything that would come between us and the Father. And so we start with fear, and many times that's just a place where a lot of us have to start with that kind of fear. And so we need to talk about hell. It's what's going on in this life is a foretaste of the stuff in hell. I think it's so important for us to realize when we see these visions. A lot of them will talk about specific punishments for specific vices, and to realize that it's kind of the natural end of that vice. If that vice possesses us, if that vice controls us, but this is where it ends. This is the logical conclusion of that vice. And so we have to look at it now in our lives and say, do I want that thing to grow up inside of me to such a point that it'll take me there? And we begin to see the seriousness of sin. We begin to see more the horror of sin, where it leads, instead of just some little, bug that we put up with. We realize that this thing's going to grow into a dragon that'll consume it.
This is interesting, and I know that everybody's sort of on a John Henry Newman kick because Bud's the director out there, and then of course it's the year of his ordination, of his canonization. But one of the talks I had the honor and privilege to get to talk about was Newman's vision in his first plain and parochial sermon talking about holiness. He makes the point that even if the damned could make it to heaven, that they wouldn't love being there because they didn't take the time on earth to come to love the things of heaven. And since that's the case, hell stops being this place of torment for, like God leveling the sort of accounting books, but in a real way is basically putting people where they thought they would be happy and living with the sort of ramifications of what they prepared for in this life. And that's not to say that there can't be conversions at the very end, and this is obviously necessitates something like a doctrine of purgatory. But the idea being that heaven's not just going to be a lot of cool things as much as you want, like big cheeseburgers and good French fries, forever. but this idea about finally a matter of love and this interplay of fear and love, of course, that, like you said, those stages that switch is another way to say, what do we truly desire and why do we desire it and how pure is that desire? And hell is a punishment, but mostly the punishment of simply falling for desires that are beneath us. And it seems to me that that's what your book is trying to show through people through what saints have said about hell in the past.
Yes, it's as St. Augustine first put it, disordered love is what we're talking about. You love something, you love things more than people, and you love things and people more than you love God. And those disordered loves, lead you in this direction. I love the way C.S. Lewis, talks about it, how, in the Lord's Prayer we say, thy will be done, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And that at the end, those who have refused to do God's will, who want their own will, in the end God says to them, okay, thy will be done. I'll give you what you want. I'll give you what you've sought all of your life. And then what they find, when all they have is themselves and whatever they've tried to absorb into themselves, what they find is eternal misery, because we weren't made for that. We were made, our hearts are restless, St. Augustine said, until they find their rest in thee. We were made for God. So that's what hell is. And all these visions, they'll talk about it, some of them explicitly, like St. Catherine, others will talk about it, but will say the worst torment of all is always the thing going on the inside of the damned soul. The disorder there, the hatred, the misery, the hopelessness, that all these things, that's really the torment. I once had a friend who said if the fires of hell are literal, they're an act of God's mercy in order to take the damned souls' minds off of their real problems, which is the torment inside. The torment inside.
Yeah, Paul, there's so much to talk about with this topic, and we've really delved into the theology. I know your book covers the visions of several saints who are given a glimpse of final damnation. You've already mentioned St. Catherine, but in your research, was there one saint or a particular vision that you'd like to give our listeners like a sneak preview of the book in the last 5 minutes of our talk together?
Oh my, they're all so compelling. And so I think in many ways, St. John Bosco's vision, which in his case is a dream, but his dreams were often the equivalent of prophetic visions, in which he was allowed to see things going on in the lives of the boys that he was caring for, to be able to warn them, you're headed this direction. And like a room, like iron gates that you have to go through, glowing red with heat, and then going deeper and deeper and deeper into the abyss of hell. That just kind of the finality of it, the seriousness of it. But I think also with you get it especially with St. Catherine, some of St. Teresa of Avila, that the sense of the soul closed in on itself was so powerful to me. Speaking, saying that what I saw, St. Catherine saw the place that would be reserved for her, would have been reserved for her in hell if she had not been saved. And, if she were to end up there. And it was a place of being closed in on yourself. It was like a niche in the wall that you're shoved in, and you get a sense of claustrophobia just reading what she writes. And that's so powerful to me, this notion that, yes, that is what a damned soul is. It is a soul that has become so hollow that it simply collapses in on itself. And just the horror of that as I put in the novel that I wrote that was set in hell, where, one of the damned says, it's, when we were kids, we worried about how the monster was under the bed, but this is even worse. The monster is not even in the bed with you. You are the monster, and you're in the monster, and the monster is in you. And that's the final horror. And you get that sense with some of these visions.
Well, so real quick before we have to let you go, for people out there who might go, oh, well, this is, I don't know, being negative. When I brought up Newman on hell, I got called a Manichaean. So how do we tell people
Classic.
that to dwell on hell is to have a proper balance between fear and sobriety? And I know that could be like a whole nother 30 minutes, but like the 1 or 2 minute way, if someone that goes like you're stoking fear too much, what would you say is the best way to like give a short answer back to that?
I would say again, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom and all kinds of other things. It's in the scriptures, not just Old Testament. Jesus says, don't fear those who can hurt you here on earth. fear the one who can cast you into hell. So if you're going to take the words of Jesus seriously, you got to take what he says about hell seriously. He talks about hell repeatedly, and there's a reason. And Jesus wasn't some kind of fearmonger. He talked about a reality that is so real and so essential for us to talk about that, in my case, okay, am I going to talk about it or not? Well, what did Jesus do? If you want to follow that simple rule, what did Jesus do? Jesus talked about hell, and he did it with mercy joined. And it's an invitation to mercy is what it is. So that's why I talk about hell.
Well, Dr. Thigpen, we're really appreciative of your time and taking the time to be with us this morning, giving our listeners, I think, a lot to think about. If people tuning in want to find out more, could you point them to where they could go, maybe online or other places to read your work and to find this particular book that we've been discussing?
Sure. This particular book, you can go to your local Catholic bookstore. You can go to tanbooks.com, the publisher. You can go to Amazon. As for my work, I don't have a working website of my own, but I do have an author page that needs updating on Amazon. You could go there to look at some of my other works.
Well, Dr. Thigpen, thank you very much. We appreciate it. And like we said, everybody, I hope you get a chance to go look at his book. So Dr. Paul Thigpen, please thank you again for coming on our show, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to find your book. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. God bless you and all your listeners.
No problem at all. Well, Bud, thank you for, I sometimes, I don't know if we tell everybody, on the show about who finds who and what guests, but Bud, you get all the credit for this one, so a thumbs up on air, buddy. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, and so when we'll get back, we'll kind of unpack about what Dr. Thigpen was sharing with us. Yep,
so it's going to be great. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr with The Uncommon Good. Stick around, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you, friends, for coming and listening to the show. Bud, you there with us? I didn't know if you got scared from the hell talk.
I thought about dropping, but I'm still here.
Well, no, like I told people before the break, we all find different folks to come on the show, but I wanted to say thank you for that one, because not everybody wants to go put a show about hell and the visions the saints seen on their radio show, but I think it's very timely to talk about this in November. So, good find on that one.
Yeah, I think I would plug the book one more time, Saints Who Saw Hell by Paul Thigpen. He does this whole discussion at the beginning about the distinction between public revelation and private revelation. And of course, as Catholics, what we believe and what we affirm in terms of our faith is what's given us in sacred scripture, and then, of course, the deposit of faith, so sacred tradition as well. But I do think these visions that God has blessed some of the saints with, and I know that term might be a little loose because some of these visions are pretty intense.
Right.
They can give us a new angle or vision on a particular piece of revelation. So Paul didn't get into this on the show, but he really gets into some of the details of things that St. John Bosco, St. Catherine of Siena, and others have seen about the last things.
Right, and maybe that's a good thing to clear up too, is that these visions might not all actually comport with each other, but precisely because in our embodied lives while we're still alive on earth, the total reality of hell, of course, would be closed off to our senses. I think I didn't mean to, but I just opened up a really technical can of worms. But the resurrected body, even of the damned, so we know that the resurrected body of those unsaved and going to heaven will be bodies like we've never experienced and able and capable to experience things primarily with the relationship with God and the angelic hosts, but also the saints, in a way that we can only vaguely, as Paul says, look in a mirror dimly. But the actual St. Augustine makes this point that the damned will have bodies like this too, so that the horror and loss that is realized in hell will be such that an embodied soul here in our world can't fully understand it as well. So there's two things to say. Wow, that means hell will be even worse than flames and worms and things like this. But that also these visions of hell I would say something akin to, the apparitions of Mary, or even sort of, almost prophetic dreams that people have in the scriptures. They're not going to be like documentaries of what hell are like. Even there, they're mediated to be presented to the human intellect in a way that they can understand. And so the significance of their value is not sort of technical information necessarily about what hell is like, but the sort of moral and eschatological realities that we need to keep in mind to live lives better and to understand the will of our Maker.
Well, I think one thing that you and Paul were getting into at the end there that's so essential to remember, and this is an insight that St. John Henry picks up on, is that there are poor ways of understanding hell. So we affirm the doctrine that the church teaches, but there's a way that we can communicate this, I think especially to children, that does create just this fear that paralyzes us. But I think, Bo, you hinted at this, and it's really essential to hear this point. When we talk about holiness in the spiritual life, we really have our own happiness in view. And so it's not that whenever we think about the law that God has given, and then, of course, the consequences of turning away from the law, it's not that God is this taskmaster who sets up arbitrary rules that, especially when I was like in my teens and 20s, I thought, oh, the teachings of the church and of Christianity, they're sort of an obstacle to the fun and the joy that I really want to experience.
Right.
Like really coming to a full understanding of the faith, we begin to see like, no, our greatest happiness is at stake. So actually living in accord with the will of God will lead us to our greatest happiness. And I think the reason, Bo, that we have to keep coming back to that point is we're living in the wake of philosophy. And a lot of people maybe haven't read the philosophy, but there's this idea that doing the right thing is sort of like doing the least fun thing. Like if you enjoy it too much, it must be wrong. And I think that just cuts against the grain of the very heart of Christianity.
Yeah, technical information-wise, this is famously said by Immanuel Kant, but he's really sort of channeling a lot of different late Christian, like early modern, but sort of late in thought Christian pieties, that the good is only good in as much as you don't like it at all, which really contrasts with more ancient theories. I mean, you have something like the Stoics that say, that duty is important, or even that you shouldn't overprize doing what makes you feel good because that can change, and certainly that all has good points. But akin with Aristotle and even sort of the larger Augustinian tradition, the argument Christianity has always made is it's in your self-interest to serve God, that really personal interest and social interest in the end actually do not compete. It only seems so because of our limited understanding of these things. The question starts to be what is really in our best interest. And it's funny, I don't know if I would say I was in an argument, but I was having a discussion with someone on Twitter this morning, and this goes to show how we have a moral language that can walk us into weird corners if we don't step back and think about them in a more holistic way. We're actually talking about the economy because, that's what I do at 7 a.m. because I'm a boring person. But they were pointing out that they're like, well, don't you want an economic system where you're free to put whatever you want first, right? Isn't that the superior way? Like, we just make an economic system, we make it neutral, and then whatever you think's important, you put first, and that's great. And I go, but that's literally how Dante describes hell, right? Is that hell is the domain where people get to live the consequences of choosing what they chose first when they chose inferior things. And so this idea that, I was making a point about the economy, that we should just sort of like let people do what they want without any sort of direction or help or moral guidance, that's like the devil's idea about how he runs hell. And when just because we have to start to think about that some things in our best interest aren't immediately gratifying, but like sort of gratifying, even just delayed a little bit, that's something that we expect children to learn, but then act like if adults say it, that we're just being, miserly or pious or ruining people's fun or these, like repressive. But everyone knows, right, that If you've ever potty trained a child, it is not immediately fun, but Lord Almighty, is it not more sanitary and eventually happiness-inducing for everybody involved with the venture? And so is sin. Even the things that we think don't have immediate consequences now, it becomes obvious the ramifications that they have in society and in the afterlife.
Well, I love that quote from C.S. Lewis that Paul mentioned, where hell is God finally saying to the impenitent soul, "Thy will be done." And I know, Bo, when we taught together, we would kind of surprise students because we would say Christianity, properly understood, is an ethics of desire, not law. And we were stealing this from Jean Vanier, who started the L'Arche Ministries to the Disabled. But that would kind of surprise them, because I think in some Sunday school classes we're kind of taught that desire is a negative thing. But what Aristotle, going back to Aristotle, what he says is that if we pay attention to our desires, it shows us important things about what brings us happiness. So you look at our desire for pleasure, even for food, and all those things are important to human life. They lead us to, sustaining our physical existence and then deep relationships. But Aristotle, even before Augustine and later great theologians, he points out that if you make those things the end or the most important part and the only thing that you're going to pursue, it won't lead to happiness. It will lead to dissolution. And so I think, again, coming back in our preaching as we talk about these things, to begin to say God desires your ultimate happiness, and Christianity is not like some Eastern religions where desire in and of itself in se is a bad thing. But we do have to start to begin to think about properly ordered desires, because if we don't pay attention to that, we are walking the path to damnation.
Yeah, so Joseph Pieper, I talk about him all the time, but I am unashamed. So Joseph Pieper has a wonderful book, The Christian Idea of Man, and he makes this point that we've overvalued, we've mistakenly said that moderation is the chief cardinal virtue of Christians. And we've done this because we looked at the modern world, at least the post-Enlightenment world, which seems to say whatever you want to do is fine. And so then we play their game and we go, oh no, so moderation is our big deal, and whatever you say, whatever you think is not fine, in fact, maybe you should even do the opposite. And this makes it start to sound like what you should do to avoid hell is to kill fun now. And then it really does start to sound like naked self-interest, right? Like, oh, well, God made these arbitrary rules and the payoff is better in the afterlife. And then people rightly go, but what if it's not? And then you get, like weird versions of Blaise Pascal's, wager and all of these things like this. But Pieper points this out, the chief cardinal virtue has always been, and especially in the Catholic world, is prudence, which is the idea of practical wisdom. What do I really ultimately want? So that's the goal of all these things. And then prudence just says, what are the intermediate steps that get me there? And so when you think about not overdoing it with alcohol or food or sex or pleasure in general, the idea is not that any of these things are bad. The question is, what do you ultimately want in life? Do you ultimately really just want booze, just want sex, just want food, just want pleasures? Or are you using those things to get at something deeper? And if you're getting at something deeper, then you have to ask, how do we use those things for the something deeper? And almost always we start to realize that even the individual pleasures we like them better when they're in community. So then when you start to think about that, community itself bespeaks to the fact that we want them for something even deeper behind all that. And we start to ask about the mystery of God and eternal life and things like this. And then prudence starts to go, well, then we should be moderate in this way and maybe not that, but not for its own sake, but to get what we actually want. And hell is the myriad ways that we misunderstand that. And then even when we are proven that we are wrong, so to speak, doubling down on what we've chosen rather than just being corrected. And so that's where pride starts to unseat all of those things. Through pride, Bud, we'll do things like not even enjoy the pleasures we supposedly want. Like we will, cut off our nose to spite our face, as the saying goes. And in many ways, that's why when, I think people know this, there's plenty of books out now that either want to say there is no hell or that people don't stay there forever, or there's a lot of worry about, can we believe in a God that punishes people eternally? But I guess this is just where I fall back to, is I've seen proof in human life that the possibility of, cutting off one's nose to spite one's face, that doesn't seem far-fetched to me. And I suppose that not everybody would agree with me, but I'm going to have to disagree back.
Well, and at the very end of the interview, you talked briefly about a proper understanding of the fear of God and having a sobriety as opposed to this deep anxiety or something. I think a way that we can flip this on its head and think about it constructively, and Bo, maybe I'll let you talk about this since you just gave a paper on it. When we start thinking, am I ready to meet God? Newman has this interesting thought about how do we gauge our preparation for heaven? And this came up in a talk you gave recently out here.
Yeah, the idea that, when you get to heaven, I mean, this is what I always joke around saying, that it's like an indulgent God in the sky who's just a grandpa who gives you whatever you want, or MTV Beach House Heaven Edition, right? That all that we can imagine is a very petty idea about what happiness means. There's a way in which the way we popularly depict heaven is an indictment about how small our imaginations are about what something can be. But suffice it to say, you think about anything that's really enjoyable to do, and I'm thinking even if you're talking Six Flags or an amusement park, or especially if it comes to something like biking in Yellowstone National Park, or hiking. All of these things actually take preparation, where if you are not prepared, or indeed if you're the opposite of prepared, these things stop being fun at all and in fact become absolutely horrible or poisonous. Even if you want to enjoy food, right? If you treat your body bad enough, then the thing that you want to enjoy it's not enjoyable anymore. It literally kills you. We are this way. We have to be habituated to the situations that we're going to put ourselves in if we're going to benefit from them at all. And if this isn't the case in bodily pleasures, certainly it's the case even in spiritual and mental pleasures, right? There is a pleasure to doing well in a subject, right? People who practice a subject and love it, they really like it. But of course, if they didn't do the hard preparation of learning the basics, then even those intellectual pursuits would fall flat. So much more will this have to be the case to enjoy God who surpasses all physical and spiritual understandings we have of what is pleasant and good and wonderful to behold in and of itself. And so the question has to be, are you going to be prepared to enjoy heaven? And all Newman is saying is that if you put a reprobate person, someone who's not prepared because they've lived a life of sin, that heaven itself would probably be like hell. Heaven is, he says, a lot like church. If you don't like church at all, you have some serious questions to ask yourself about what are you going to do in heaven eternally, where presumably the main job you have is to praise God. And so hell starts to be just the manifestation going the other way, is if even food and if even the sort of easy pleasures can eventually become poison to us, hell is just the place where those who do not, after given chance after chance, to try to reform themselves, to learn to love the things that they were made for or that are higher than themselves, they're going to be left to love the things lower than themselves, and eventually those too will be the primary sources of pain and suffering and, quite frankly, punishment.
Yeah, and I think on our show, we always come back to the question of how does all this theology tie into the common good and to the themes of the show. And with the doctrine of hell, it's really easy, because when we reflect on this mystery, there's our individual responsibility, and we need to take seriously our own calling by God and what that means for our lives. But as many recent theologians have emphasized, we're not saved alone. God calls us into a family. We're incorporated into the mystical body of Christ. And so, as I heard a recent speaker put it, our best barometer for our relationship with God is our relationship to those around us. And if you look at even Christ's teaching that in the end, how will God separate the sheep from the goats? I mean, he gets back to this question of what did you do for the least of these for those who were in prison, or for those who were hungry and naked. And again, like, we always have to be careful, because it's not like it's not like this data sheet where God kind of tallies up like, oh, Bo was at the soup kitchen this Saturday or whatever. But I mean, I think that is, like, I like the word barometer. If you feel complacent and saved and good to go, but you find yourself, mainly living a life that's about your own self-interest in the negative sense of the term, like, there are probably some serious questions to ask this morning.
Right. I mean, if we're going to go behold a God who forever and be with him, who loves the leper and the poor and the despised, it's not a question of getting a balance sheet. You can never earn your place in heaven. The bald question is, how will you enjoy being with this God who told you what he was like and where he was on earth, and you yourself either never learn to love that or never put yourself in the situations to learn to do so? And that really is the ultimate question in all of this, is none of us are going to save ourselves, and none of us are going to ever earn the right to behold God. But God has given us the sure path to learn to love him, and to learn to love as best we can in this life, and finished off, so to speak, in purgatory, the capacity to love only him and love all things through him. And if we're not willing to open ourselves up and submit ourselves to that work now, then hell is just the reality that we will not do so, and we will instead live with the consequences of adoring the masters of our lives, which were things that were below us, and will ultimately be poison and convict us.
I guess if I could put it in a pithy way, and I know we're wrapping up, the French existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, hell is other people.
Right.
And really, Christianity, heaven is praising God with other people. So if either the God part or the other people part doesn't sound appealing to you, that's where, an examination of conscience is necessary.
Right, because in the end, that's to say that you won't be happy anywhere. And that starts to be, I think, and besides mental health issues, depression, all those things taking very seriously. But there's this very basic question existentially we have to ask ourselves, and if that is, if you can't be happy loving the things that God said are lovable, none of the things will make you happy, because all other things sift away and go away and eventually run through our fingers. So hopefully in this month of November, we start to think about the ways with the four last things that they're not just simply to scare us, but they bring us closer to the reality of God. So this is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, our city, our state, our nation, our whole world, solar system, galaxy, galaxies of galaxies, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.